Walter Cronkite closes the CBS Evening News on November 22, 1963, tears visible in his eyes as he removes his glasses and announces that President Kennedy has died. Across America, 93% of households are watching the same broadcast. They trust Cronkite so completely that he's known as the most trusted man in America. When he declares the Vietnam War unwinnable in 1968, President Johnson reportedly says, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Fast forward to January 6, 2021. A mob storms the U.S. Capitol believing the presidential election was stolen, despite dozens of courts and election officials from both parties declaring it the most secure election in American history. Meanwhile, millions of other Americans refuse to take a life-saving vaccine because they don't trust government health recommendations. Outside, protesters carry signs reading, "Trust no one," and "Question everything." Two moments, separated by less than 60 years. In the first, Americans overwhelmingly trusted their institutions to tell them the truth. In the second, Americans can't agree on basic facts about reality itself. What happened in between wasn't just political polarization or technological disruption. It was the systematic destruction of the social glue that holds democracies together: institutional trust. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we uncover the hidden forces that shaped our world. If you're watching this from anywhere around the globe, drop a comment below telling us what time it is, where you are, and which city you're viewing from, and hit that subscribe button. Because what you're about to discover explains not just America's current crisis, but how the most trusted democracy in human history became a society where truth itself is up for debate. This isn't a story about Republicans versus Democrats, conservatives versus liberals, or any particular political ideology. This is the story of how America's institutions committed suicide, and why understanding that process is crucial for anyone who wants to understand how modern democracies die. The collapse of institutional trust didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen by accident. It was engineered by people who understood exactly what they were destroying and why. But here's the twist that makes this story particularly chilling. Many of the people who started this process thought they were saving democracy, not destroying it. Let me take you back to 1972, to a moment when everything Americans thought they knew about their government was about to shatter. On June 17, 1972, 5 men were arrested for breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. It seemed like a routine burglary, barely worth mentioning in most newspapers. The Washington Post assigned the story to 2 young, relatively unknown reporters named Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. What Woodward and Bernstein uncovered over the next 2 years would fundamentally transform how Americans viewed their government. The burglary wasn't random crime. It was part of a massive conspiracy that reached all the way to the Oval Office. President Nixon had authorized illegal surveillance of political opponents, obstruction of justice, and abuse of federal agencies for partisan purposes. But here's what's often forgotten about Watergate. The system worked exactly as it was supposed to. Investigative journalists uncovered the truth. Congressional committees from both parties investigated thoroughly. Courts upheld the rule of law. Republican leaders eventually told Nixon he had to resign. The Constitution's checks and balances functioned perfectly. Americans should have emerged from Watergate with greater confidence in their democratic institutions. Instead, they emerged with permanent suspicion of all institutions. The problem wasn't what the institutions did during Watergate. The problem was what Americans learned about what institutions had been doing before anyone was watching. As journalists and congressional investigators dug deeper into government activities, they uncovered decades of secret programs that violated everything Americans thought their government stood for. The CIA had conducted mind control experiments on unwitting subjects. The FBI had infiltrated and disrupted civil rights organizations. The military had lied about progress in Vietnam while secretly expanding the war into Cambodia and Laos. Each revelation followed the same pattern. Institutions had lied to the public, covered up their actions, and betrayed the values they claimed to represent. Even worse, these weren't rogue operations by radical individuals. They were systematic programs approved at the highest levels and carried out over many years. The Pentagon Papers, published by the New York Times in 1971, revealed that government officials had knowingly misled the public about Vietnam for over a decade. They knew the war was unwinnable but continued sending young Americans to die while telling the public that victory was just around the corner. Daniel Ellsberg, the defense analyst who leaked the Pentagon Papers, later explained his motivation. I felt that as an American citizen, as a responsible citizen, I could no longer cooperate in concealing this information from the American public. I did this clearly at my own jeopardy, and I am prepared to answer to all consequences of this decision. But Ellsberg's heroic act of conscience had an unintended consequence. Americans began to assume that whatever the government was telling them publicly was probably false, and that the real truth was always something darker and more sinister. This shift from healthy skepticism to reflexive cynicism created what political scientists call institutional nihilism, the belief that all institutions are fundamentally corrupt and that official explanations are always lies designed to hide ugly truths. But institutional nihilism was about to get a powerful new ally. Television news that discovered cynicism was more profitable than trust. In 1968, television news was still operating under what broadcasters called the public trust doctrine. News divisions were expected to serve the public interest even if they lost money. Walter Cronkite, Huntley and Brinkley, and other anchor teams had enormous cultural authority because they prioritized accuracy and objectivity over entertainment and profit. But television was becoming more competitive and more commercial. In 1970, the Federal Communications Commission changed its rules to allow networks to own more of their programming, which meant news divisions were under pressure to become profit centers rather than public services. The change was gradual but decisive. News programs began to prioritize stories that generated strong emotional responses over stories that were merely important. Conflict sold better than consensus. Scandal sold better than competence. Cynicism sold better than trust. By the 1980s, television news had embraced what communications researcher Larry Sabato called attack journalism. The assumption that politicians were always hiding something, that official statements were always spin, and that the most newsworthy angle on any story was how it revealed incompetence or corruption. This created a vicious cycle. Politicians became more defensive and controlling in response to hostile coverage, which made them appear more secretive and dishonest, which justified even more aggressive coverage. Journalists began to confuse skepticism with cynicism, and audiences began to confuse cynicism with wisdom. Roger Ailes, who would later create Fox News, understood this dynamic perfectly. In the 1970s, he was a media consultant for Republican politicians, and he developed a strategy he called the paranoid style. Instead of defending Republican policies on their merits, he taught his clients to attack the credibility of the institutions that were criticizing them. People already don't trust the media, Ailes explained in a private memo. We just need to give them permission to express that distrust publicly. When journalists criticized Republican positions, Ailes taught his clients to respond by attacking journalism itself. When government agencies released unfavorable data, he taught them to attack the agencies rather than address the data. This strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. You didn't need better policies or stronger arguments. You just needed to destroy the credibility of anyone who disagreed with you. And because institutional cynicism was already widespread, audiences were receptive to attacks on institutional credibility. But Ailes was just getting warmed up. His real masterstroke came in 1996 when he launched Fox News with the slogan, "Fair and Balanced." The genius of Fox News wasn't its conservative bias. Many media outlets had editorial leanings. The genius was that Fox News explicitly positioned itself as the only trustworthy source of information in a world where all other institutions were lying to you. Fox News didn't just report news differently. It told viewers that other news sources were enemy propaganda designed to deceive them. It didn't just offer conservative analysis, it claimed that non-conservative analysis was deliberate misinformation. It didn't just criticize liberal politicians, it argued that the entire federal bureaucracy was part of a conspiracy to undermine conservative values. This was something new in American history. A major media organization whose business model was based on destroying trust in all other institutions, including other media organizations. But Fox News couldn't have succeeded if the ground hadn't already been prepared by institutional failures that had nothing to do with conservative media. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, American institutions kept providing ammunition for their critics through a series of spectacular failures that seemed to confirm every conspiracy theory about institutional incompetence and corruption. The Challenger space shuttle exploded in 1986 because NASA managers ignored engineers' warnings about faulty equipment. The Iran-Contra scandal revealed that Reagan administration officials had secretly sold weapons to Iran to fund Nicaraguan rebels, directly violating congressional prohibitions. The savings and loan crisis of the 1980s cost taxpayers over $125 billion because regulatory agencies failed to stop obvious fraud and mismanagement. Each failure followed the same pattern. Institutions made disastrous decisions, covered up their mistakes, and then claimed that the problems were unforeseeable and unavoidable. Officials who were responsible for failures were rarely held accountable, while ordinary Americans paid the cost through higher taxes, lost savings, or in the case of Challenger, lost lives. But these institutional failures pale in comparison to what came next. The Iraq War, which would deliver a blow to institutional credibility from which American democracy has never recovered. In February 2003, Secretary of State Colin Powell stood before the United Nations Security Council and presented detailed evidence that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction that posed an imminent threat to American security. Powell's presentation was supported by CIA intelligence, endorsed by congressional leaders from both parties, and accepted by most mainstream journalists. It was all false. Not mistaken, not incomplete, not open to interpretation. False. There were no weapons of mass destruction. There was no imminent threat. The intelligence was manufactured, the evidence was fabricated, and the officials who presented it knew they were deceiving the public. Over 4,400 American soldiers died in Iraq. Over 100,000 Iraqi civilians died. The war cost over $2 trillion. An entire region was destabilized. And it was all based on lies told by the most senior officials in the American government and accepted without sufficient scrutiny by the institutions that were supposed to serve as checks on government power. The Iraq War wasn't just a policy failure, it was an institutional failure that exposed how the entire system had become corrupted by groupthink, careerism, and the desire to avoid challenging official narratives. Intelligence agencies told officials what they wanted to hear, rather than what the evidence actually showed. Congressional leaders accepted administration claims without serious investigation because challenging them would be politically difficult. Journalists amplified government propaganda because access to officials was more valuable than independent verification of their claims. When the truth about Iraq finally emerged, it confirmed the worst suspicions of institutional cynics. American institutions would lie about anything, including matters of war and peace, if it served their short-term interests. But Iraq was still just the setup for the main event, the 2008 financial crisis, which would destroy what remained of Americans' faith in their economic institutions. For decades, Americans had been told that financial markets were self-regulating, that banking executives were the smartest people in the room, and that government regulation only interfered with efficient market outcomes. Alan Greenspan, chairman of the Federal Reserve, was celebrated as a guru whose understanding of economics bordered on the mystical. Then the entire system collapsed. The 2008 financial crisis wasn't caused by unforeseeable events or natural market cycles. It was caused by systematic fraud, regulatory capture, and reckless speculation that anyone paying attention could have predicted would end in disaster. Banks had been making loans to people who obviously couldn't repay them, then packaging those loans into complex securities that they sold to investors while betting against those same securities. Rating agencies gave AAA ratings to investments they knew were worthless. Regulatory agencies ignored obvious warning signs because their officials were more concerned about their future career prospects in the financial industry than their current responsibilities to the public. When the system finally collapsed, the people who caused the crisis were bailed out with taxpayer money, while the people who suffered from the crisis lost their jobs, homes, and retirement savings. Almost none of the executives responsible for the fraud were prosecuted. Most received bonuses for their role in destroying the global economy. The message was unmistakable. American institutions serve the interests of the wealthy and powerful, while ordinary Americans pay the costs of institutional failure. The system is rigged, the game is fixed, and the people in charge are criminals who will never be held accountable for their crimes. This wasn't paranoid conspiracy thinking. This was rational assessment of observable evidence. American institutions had repeatedly lied to the public, failed in their basic responsibilities, and protected their own interests at the expense of the common good. But institutional cynicism, however justified, created a vacuum that was filled by something even more dangerous: alternative reality systems that offered their own version of institutional authority. By 2008, millions of Americans were getting most of their information from sources that existed specifically to undermine trust in traditional institutions. Conservative talk radio, Fox News, and increasingly popular internet forums didn't just criticize mainstream institutions. They provided alternative facts, alternative experts, and alternative explanations for events. These alternative media systems were particularly effective because they addressed real institutional failures while providing psychological comfort that traditional journalism couldn't offer. Instead of admitting that complex problems had complex causes, they offered simple explanations that identified clear villains and promised simple solutions. Economic inequality wasn't caused by technological change, globalization, and policy choices made over decades by officials from both parties. It was caused by immigrants, liberals, or global conspiracies. Political dysfunction wasn't the result of institutional design problems and cultural polarization. It was caused by corruption, conspiracies, or the other political party. Alternative media told audiences what they wanted to hear: that their problems weren't their fault, that simple solutions existed, and that only evil or stupid people disagreed with obvious truths. But alternative media couldn't have gained mainstream influence without help from an unexpected source: the internet platforms that promised to democratize information and restore trust between institutions and citizens. When Mark Zuckerberg launched Facebook, his stated mission was to make the world more open and connected. When Jack Dorsey created Twitter, he envisioned it as a tool for spreading information and facilitating democratic conversation. When Google founders Larry Page and Sergey Brin developed their search algorithm, they believed they were creating a technology that would help people find accurate information more efficiently. Instead, they created the most powerful misinformation distribution systems in human history. The problem wasn't that internet platforms were biased toward particular viewpoints. The problem was that they were biased toward engagement over accuracy. Their algorithms were designed to capture attention and generate clicks, not to promote truth or facilitate democratic deliberation. This created what information scientists call the engagement trap. Content that made people angry, fearful, or outraged generated more clicks, shares, and comments than content that was merely accurate or important. Conspiracy theories spread faster than factual reporting. Partisan attacks got more engagement than measured analysis. Extremist content outperformed moderate content. The platform's algorithmic recommendation systems learned to feed users increasingly extreme content because extreme content generated the emotional responses that kept people online longer. Someone who started by reading mainstream conservative news would gradually be recommended more extreme conservative content. Someone interested in alternative health would be guided toward anti-vaccine conspiracy theories. Someone concerned about government overreach would be directed toward militia groups and sovereign citizen movements. This wasn't an unintended consequence of neutral technology. This was the predictable result of business models that monetized attention, regardless of the social consequences of capturing that attention. But the engagement trap was about to be weaponized by foreign adversaries who understood that destroying institutional trust was the most efficient way to damage American democracy. In 2013, a Russian troll factory called the Internet Research Agency began a systematic campaign to manipulate American political discourse through social media. Their goal wasn't to promote particular candidates or policies. Their goal was to increase polarization, spread confusion, and undermine faith in democratic institutions. The Russians understood something that many Americans didn't. You don't need to control information to control political outcomes. You just need to destroy people's ability to distinguish between reliable and unreliable information. Russian operatives created fake social media accounts that pretended to be American activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens. They organized rallies for opposing sides and sometimes scheduled them at the same time and place to maximize conflict. They spread conspiracy theories about election fraud, police brutality, immigration, and other divisive topics. But here's the most sophisticated part of the Russian operation. They didn't just spread false information, they spread true information in ways designed to maximize social division. They would amplify real stories about police misconduct to inflame racial tensions, then amplify real stories about crime to inflame fear of minorities. They would promote accurate criticism of government policies alongside wild conspiracy theories about government motives. The goal wasn't to make Americans believe particular falsehoods. The goal was to make Americans unable to agree on basic facts about reality. And it worked. By 2016, Americans were living in what information researchers call epistemic bubbles. Closed information systems where people were exposed only to information that confirmed their existing beliefs and biases. Conservatives and liberals weren't just disagreeing about policy preferences. They were disagreeing about basic factual questions that should have been easily verifiable. They consumed different news sources, trusted different experts, and inhabited different versions of reality. This epistemic fragmentation made democratic governance nearly impossible. You can't have productive political debates when people can't agree on fundamental facts. You can't make collective decisions when people are using completely different information to evaluate their options. But epistemic fragmentation was just the opening act. The main event came in 2016 when Donald Trump discovered that attacking institutional credibility was a more effective political strategy than defending policy positions. Trump's political genius wasn't that he offered better solutions to America's problems. His genius was that he understood how to exploit institutional distrust for political gain more effectively than any politician in American history. Trump didn't just criticize media coverage of his campaign. He declared that journalism itself was fake news and the enemy of the people. He didn't just dispute unfavorable polling data. He claimed that polling was a conspiracy to suppress his supporters. He didn't just disagree with intelligence agencies' assessments. He declared that intelligence agencies were part of a deep state plot to overthrow his presidency. This strategy worked because institutional trust had already been severely damaged by decades of institutional failures and attack journalism. Trump didn't create institutional cynicism. He weaponized existing institutional cynicism for political gain. But Trump took institutional destruction to a new level by attacking the credibility of institutions, even when they were supporting him. When FBI Director James Comey announced an investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails just days before the 2016 election, Trump praised the FBI's professionalism. When Comey later announced an investigation into Russian interference in the election, Trump declared that the FBI was part of a conspiracy against him. This wasn't about defending himself against unfair attacks. This was about establishing that institutional credibility only existed when institutions were saying things he wanted to hear. Any institution that contradicted Trump, challenged Trump, or simply failed to enthusiastically support Trump became part of the conspiracy against him. Trump's approach was particularly destructive because it didn't require Americans to trust any alternative institutions. It just required them to distrust all existing institutions. You didn't need to believe that Trump was telling the truth. You just needed to believe that everyone else was lying. This nihilistic approach to institutional credibility reached its logical conclusion on January 6, 2021, when Trump convinced thousands of his supporters that American democracy itself was a fraud that needed to be overthrown. The people who stormed the Capitol weren't responding to evidence of election fraud. They were responding to 4 years of systematic attacks on the credibility of any institution that might contradict Trump's claims. Courts, election officials, journalists, poll workers, and even Trump's own Justice Department had all been characterized as part of a vast conspiracy against the American people. Once you believe that all institutions are fundamentally corrupt and that official explanations are always lies, political violence becomes not just justified, but necessary. If democracy itself is a fraud, then overthrowing democracy becomes patriotic. January 6th wasn't the cause of America's trust crisis, it was the inevitable result of America's trust crisis. But here's the most troubling aspect of institutional collapse. Once trust is destroyed, it becomes almost impossible to rebuild, because the very institutions that would need to lead the rebuilding process have lost the credibility necessary to do so. When public health officials recommend vaccines, millions of Americans assume they're lying or being manipulated by pharmaceutical companies. When climate scientists warn about global warming, millions of Americans dismiss them as part of a political agenda. When election officials certify vote counts, millions of Americans believe the results are fraudulent. This isn't just political polarization. This is epistemic chaos. Americans can't agree on basic facts about reality because they don't trust the institutions that are supposed to help them distinguish between reliable and unreliable information. The consequences extend far beyond politics. When people don't trust medical institutions, they don't get life-saving treatments. When people don't trust educational institutions, they don't prepare their children for economic success. When people don't trust scientific institutions, they make decisions that endanger themselves and their communities. America is experiencing what political scientists call democratic deconsolidation, the process by which democracies lose the social trust and institutional credibility necessary to function effectively. Citizens stop believing that democratic institutions can solve collective problems, so they stop participating in democratic processes. Politicians stop believing that their opponents will accept electoral outcomes, so they stop playing by democratic rules. This doesn't necessarily lead to immediate authoritarian takeover. It can lead to decades of social dysfunction, economic stagnation, and political instability that gradually makes democratic governance impossible. But the story doesn't end here, because scattered across America and around the world, people are experimenting with ways to rebuild institutional trust in the digital age. Some of these experiments focus on transparency and accountability. Organizations like ProPublica practice accountability journalism that focuses on investigating institutional failures and holding officials responsible for their actions. Cities like Reykjavik, Iceland, have created participatory budgeting systems that give citizens direct input into government spending decisions. Countries like Estonia have built digital government systems that make bureaucratic processes transparent and efficient. Other experiments focus on creating new forms of expertise and credibility. Scientists are developing open science practices that make research data and methods publicly available for verification. Journalists are experimenting with collaborative verification systems that involve multiple independent sources confirming important stories. Citizens are creating fact-checking cooperatives that help communities identify and debunk misinformation. Still, other experiments focus on rebuilding social trust through local engagement. Communities are creating citizen assemblies that bring diverse groups together to deliberate on complex issues. Neighborhoods are organizing civic technology projects that use digital tools to solve local problems. Schools are teaching civic literacy that helps students understand how democratic institutions work and why they matter. These experiments suggest that institutional trust can be rebuilt, but only through sustained effort that addresses both the structural causes of institutional failure and the cultural causes of institutional cynicism. Rebuilding trust requires institutions that actually deserve trust. This means holding officials accountable for their actions, making institutional processes transparent and accessible, and prioritizing public service over private gain. It means admitting mistakes, correcting errors, and placing long-term credibility above short-term political advantage. But rebuilding trust also requires citizens who understand how institutions work, why they matter, and how to participate in making them better. This means moving beyond cynical detachment toward engaged criticism that seeks to improve institutions rather than destroy them. It means learning to distinguish between healthy skepticism and destructive nihilism. Most importantly, rebuilding institutional trust requires addressing the underlying social and economic conditions that make people vulnerable to anti-institutional appeals. When people feel that institutions serve only the wealthy and powerful, they become receptive to arguments that all institutions are corrupt. When people feel that the system is rigged against them, they become attracted to leaders who promise to destroy the system. Institutional trust can't be rebuilt through public relations campaigns or communication strategies. It can only be rebuilt by creating institutions that actually serve the public interest and by ensuring that the benefits of institutional success are shared broadly across society. The collapse of trust in American institutions wasn't inevitable, and it isn't irreversible. Other democracies have faced similar crises and emerged stronger, but recovery requires acknowledging the depth of the problem, understanding its multiple causes, and committing to the long-term work of rebuilding democratic culture. This work starts with individual choices about how to consume information, how to engage with disagreement, and how to participate in civic life. It continues with collective choices about how to structure institutions, how to regulate technology platforms, and how to educate citizens for democratic participation. The alternative isn't just political dysfunction, it's the collapse of the social foundations that make free societies possible. When institutions lose credibility, strongmen fill the vacuum. When truth becomes partisan, power becomes arbitrary. When democratic norms collapse, democratic freedoms disappear. Americans built the most successful democratic institutions in human history, but they also demonstrated how quickly those institutions can be undermined when citizens lose faith in their value. The question now is whether Americans can rebuild what they've destroyed before it's too late. That rebuilding begins with understanding that institutional trust isn't a luxury for stable times. It's a necessity for human flourishing in complex societies. We trust institutions not because they're perfect, but because they're better than the alternatives. We improve institutions not by destroying them, but by holding them accountable to their highest ideals. The collapse of trust in American institutions is one of the most important stories of our time, but it's not the end of the story. The next chapter is being written now by citizens who choose engagement over cynicism, by officials who choose service over self-interest, and by communities that choose cooperation over conflict. Professor Archive will continue exploring the hidden forces that shape our world, but this particular story is still unfolding. Each of us, through our daily choices about how to seek truth, how to engage with institutions, and how to participate in democratic life, becomes an author of whether institutional trust can be rebuilt or whether democratic societies will continue to fragment. Before you go, remember to subscribe to Professor Archive if this exploration of institutional collapse opened your eyes to patterns you hadn't fully understood before. Drop a comment below, letting us know what time it is, where you are, and which city you're viewing from, and share your thoughts. Do you trust the institutions in your community? What would it take for you to have more confidence in democratic governance? How can societies distinguish between healthy criticism and destructive cynicism? The collapse of trust in American institutions explains much about our current moment, but it doesn't determine our future. That future depends on choices we make starting today about whether to remain trapped in cycles of cynicism and destruction, or to begin the hard work of rebuilding the social trust that makes democratic freedom possible.